Good afternoon, welcome, or good morning wherever you are. Welcome to the Contact Live Wednesday webinar. I'm delighted to be hosting our speaker, Nancy Roberts, who's the CEO of Umbrella Analytics, amongst other things. And today, Nancy's going to tell us all about auditing your output for diversity of representation. I personally feel that this is right at the very heart of what Contact is. We're at the intersection of content and technology, and Nancy talks a great deal about really interesting AI applications, looking at really critically important issues to do with diversity, inclusivity, and all of those good things. We're on Zoom webinar. We would encourage you to question Nancy throughout the event. We haven't got your mics on, you're going to be muted. So please do just add those to the Q&A tab, and then we'll come back to them at the end. We've got a straight half an hour. We're going to finish bang on 5 o'clock for a variety of reasons. Nancy's had a fantastic career in publishing, culminating in being the Global Operations Director Academic at Cambridge University Press. She still works in publishing through Maverick as their head of tech and content. And she is the founder of Umbrella, which is a tech startup using data analytics, AI, and machine learning to help businesses realize the benefits of a more diverse workforce. It's a really heartfelt and important area for me and for Contact. I'm going to shut up now. I'm going to hand you over to Nancy Roberts. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks, Clive. So bear with me while I just my screen up for you. Hopefully that's going to show up for you all now. Okay, so great to be here, and thanks to Clive for a lovely introduction. And as he said, we're going to do a kind of whistle-stop ride through why this is such an important issue, and just really scratch the surface of why I think you need to be thinking about it in your businesses. So do feel free to ask questions. Happy to go more into anything that's of interest, but I'm going to whiz through the presentation. I have got a few slides, but don't worry, it's not going to be too wordy. So a little bit about me. Clive covered some of this in the intro, so I won't bore you with it. But just to say, if you're on Twitter, find me at Umbrella Data, where I tweet about ethical AI, about diversity and inclusion issues, and also about publishing more generally. So I'd love to see you there. Feel free to contact me through Twitter if you're on there. So why do I care about this particular topic so much? Well, it's mainly because of this, because we know that publishers stand at this kind of interface where they control access to knowledge to some degree. Of course, that's changing now as we live in a world where technology is enabling knowledge to be more widely accessed, but published outputs still have that kudos and that kind of imprimatur that people place a particular value on. So if you're involved in the publishing process in a decision-making capacity now, whether that's as a commissioning editor of a book, or whether it's on an editorial board for a journal, or whether it's as a peer reviewer who's passing comment on work that may or may not then get published, you're in a position of power there. And as those of you who are familiar with your superheroes will know, with great power comes great responsibility. And I think in the past, we have not necessarily understood the level and the depth of our responsibility to manage this process. And that's what I want to spend a bit of time unpacking. We know that there's bias in the publishing process. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. And, you know, I just quoted from an eLife report here, which is really worth reading if you haven't already read it, and the DOI is on the slide there. But they found, by looking at a series of data, that women are underrepresented in the peer review process, but also that editors of both genders tend to favour their own gender. So if women are underrepresented in that process, then we can see that women are likely to be underrepresented in what actually gets published. And of course, we know that this is not merely a gender issue. This is from an article that was published on Psychology Today by a researcher who was talking about racial bias, or, you know, let's be explicit and say racism, in some of the feedback that she'd received. And I think this is very interesting because it's a lot more kind of couched, but the output is the same. You know, I'm concerned about the sample. black people, don't really care about them. You know, maybe you should look for a more specialized journal and not try to, you know, have scientific research about black people in the public, you know, in the mainstream. So, you know, we've got different levels of bias and different experiences that people are having. Some of this is very visible in the data in terms of what gets published. Some of it is more hidden potentially, or more kind of implicit, but it's there throughout the process. So all of these people who are reading papers, making decisions about editorial outputs, there's always a risk of bias, and that's not deliberate, and it's not to criticize anyone. We're all biased as human beings, but we have to be attentive to this as an industry, I think. So the question I would put to you, if you're someone who works in a publisher, is how diverse are your gatekeepers? And if any of you are as old as me, you might recognize a little Ghostbusters allusion in that picture on the left there. So perhaps some of you are too young, but anyway, made me smile. So I think, you know, look at your gatekeepers and ask yourself, does this look like a good representative diversity of opinions and voices that are making these gatekeeping decisions? If you try to do that, the first thing you'll probably tell me is, actually, I'm not sure how diverse our group of gatekeepers is. I can't really, I don't know. Like, I think you're probably right. It might not be diverse, but I can't really say. And the next thing you'll say to me is, we just don't have any data. We just don't have it. And I would say that someone says this to me about once a week. So, you know, it's a thing I hear a lot. We don't have any data. We can't do anything about it. We don't have any data. My answer is, yeah, you do. I've never met a publishing company that doesn't have something that looks a little bit like this, whether bigger, smaller, or whatever. But as an industry, we generate data all the time. We generate information all the time. It might not be in a spreadsheet, it might not be exactly how you want it to look, but you've got data. It's just not, you know, it's not clean and tidy, and they're ready for you to do exactly what you want to do with it. So this is if I have a takeaway from this session, this is it, which is that good quality data is a journey, it's not a destination. So if you think that you can just go to your systems and find all this data and get on with it, that's brilliant. And if you can, go for it. But I haven't yet met a publisher who's got a depth of data around the diversity of things like their peer reviews and their editorial boards. Oftentimes they've got the authors' names, although sometimes not always their full names, it may just be an initial. Oftentimes they've got their affiliation. Sometimes they might have their ORCID identifiers, but very often they don't have an awful lot more than that, and they may not even have all of that. So I think there's a kind of hesitation sometimes to take any action unless you've got perfect data, and you will never have perfect data. So change that mindset, start thinking about data as a kind of journey that you need to go on. And think about ways that you can make that data better, because if you never address that problem, you're going to be in the same situation 5 and 10 years down the line as you are right now. It's not going to get better on its own. So this is what we do, and just to be sure that you're not missing anything here, this is the critical step with all the big red arrows and alarm bells going off, which is once you've got your data, you need to enrich it. And there are ways to do that. Technology gives us lots of ability to do that. So this is the process that we follow. We will take in data, and as I say, that can be as simple as just the name of the corresponding author of a journal article. What we'll then do is try to enrich that data. So we will try to find out, okay, who is this person? What do we know about them? Where do they live? What university do they work for? What else have they published? What gender are they? What race are they? How can we find out information about them? And this, I think, is where sometimes publishers feel a bit queasy, because it starts to sound a little bit like surveillance or something. But we mostly are using information in the public domain. So, you know, we can use technology to go and scrape data about who people are, where they work, what they've published in. All of that information is usually freely accessible, and it's been shared by that individual. And that gives us an awful lot of clues. But there are obviously other things we can do, and AI gives us the opportunity to make inferences from our data. Again, this can sometimes be a place where people get a bit queasy, because, well, how do we know that the AI is robust? And I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I think the point of this is, you know, it's not necessarily so much about the methodology of how you enrich your data. The point is that you need to enrich it. As I say, you're not going to, it's extremely unlikely you're just going to be able to run a report, get some data out, do some analysis and say, right, this is what we need to change. It's likely that there's going to be a process that will get you to that point. But don't let that put you off, and think about ways that you can enrich that data set, however that might be appropriate for your organization. We also are great advocates at Umbrella of benchmarking data. So it's great to have a view on what you're doing, but it's also useful to have a wider context about how that compares to society as a whole, for example, but also to other people in the industry. So are you seeing fewer papers by women get published than perhaps some of your competitors, and if so, why? That will give you some useful things to investigate and dig into. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about how you can do that benchmarking. We then go on to provide visualizations and predictive modeling, and there's lots more that you can do with that data, but if you don't want to go that far, then I would say the first 3 steps of this process, the most important: get the data that you have, enrich it as much as you can, and then set some reasonable benchmarks so you can see whether you're better, worse, or different from where you should be and from where other people are. So this is the process that we use. As I say, this is by no means like the perfect and only process, but this is what we do. So we work with an ethical AI partner, and they help us to take the heavy lifting out of the process. So if we provide them with names, they have a database of millions and millions of names that they validated, and they will then infer certain characteristics about that person from their name. Now, of course, this is not perfect, right? There is lots of, humans are quirky, and there are lots of reasons why this may not be 100% accurate. But what we tend to find is we can with a reasonable degree of confidence, by which I mean statistically sort of 80 to 90% confidence, infer from a name the gender and the kind of ethnicity in terms of ethnic background of that person. As I say, there's times when we can't do it, and there's certainly some areas of the world where that's harder than others. But again, we're talking here about an imperfect world. So I think 80%, 90% confidence that we've got something useful is better than 0, and therefore not trying. So what we do is we use that technology to give us a first cut view of our data. What we'll then do is identify where we think it might not be as reliable as we would like. And that's where we bring human validation into that process. So as I say, that might be using the ORCID database to find that person, identify them, ask them some of those questions to validate what we found out. It might be that we get an expert in a particular ethnicity or region to help us identify whether there's ways that we can refine some of those distinctions. So for example, it can be quite difficult to sort of segregate different parts of China or parts of the world that China considers part of China, if that makes sense. So with some names, it can be quite difficult to say with confidence whether they're Chinese, Taiwanese, Hong Kong. So again, we might seek out experts in that area who have a deeper understanding of some of the histories of that language, who can then help us to get more confidence around some of that. And of course, we will use self-identification as well. So if we can speak to people and ask and say to them, this is what we're seeing, does this resonate with how you would describe yourself? That gives us, again, a greater degree of confidence around some areas of this. So what we end up with is a first cut of the data from the AI technology, which, as with anything driven by machine learning, is constantly improving. So, what's 80% confidence today might, as that technology improves and they take in more data and they take in more validation, that confidence level goes up anyway. We'll then use the human research that we've done, and we'll bring those 2 data sets together to try and get every data point as close to certainty as we think we can get it. And I say again, it's never 100%, but what we're really looking at here is with huge data sets. And if you're a large commercial publisher with 5,000 journals, every one of those journal articles has a corresponding author, probably a range of secondary authors. It has a peer, certain peer reviews have been applied to it, certain editorial boards have made decisions around it. It's the data gets very, very big very, very quickly. So we have to find some ways to shortcut some of this and kind of get to a level of data that we're confident enough that the trends in there are reliable enough for us to do some work around, even if there may be some individual data points in there which have been misrepresented. So having got your data and having sort of got to a degree of confidence that you're happy with about that, as I said before, I strongly recommend that you try to benchmark that in any ways that you can to see, to try and get some insight onto how that data compares. And again, there's a lot that you can do relatively cheaply and easily in this area. So some of you will know this, but there are many open data resources on the web, and that's growing all the time. Some of these I've only come across in the past few months. Some of them I've been using for a good couple of years. So Google Open Data aggregates a lot of open data sources and has quite a sort of intuitive interface for you to ask questions of it. The Open Data Institute is a UK-based institute who support people to make their data open, and they advocate for open data, but they also have a lot of resources around where you can find open data and how you can use it. The Registry of Open Data on AWS is basically a kind of index of anything on Amazon Web Servers that is open for you to use. And of course, as we know, many organizations use Amazon Web Servers as their cloud supplier. So there's a lot of data on there. And if those individual customers have said that this is an open data set, that will appear in the registry. And then of course, you've got governmental organizations, non-governmental organizations, people like the OECD generate huge amounts of open data. The UK government, the Office for National Statistics has huge amounts of open data. So there's lots and lots of places you can go. And I guess in the academic space, just seems like you may be losing sound. So I'm going to move my microphone a bit closer and hope that that's better. In the academic space, obviously there's data around, in the UK, there's data around higher education diversity, there's data around research output diversity that HESA collects, the Higher Education Institute. So I would say, like, think about the kind of data that you need, but think creatively about how you might benchmark that. So there's lots of census data available. There's lots of data available from the perspective of how many people have gone to university from different socioeconomic backgrounds, different classes, different cultures, different races. There's lots of information about research outputs that have been funded, and often they will have data about what their demographics look like. So be creative in thinking, how can you get some meaningful views into this data? The other thing I would recommend is that where possible, you try to use standard classifiers that people will understand. This is a really difficult area because, as we know, people where, I don't know, 50 years ago or however long we want to go back, male and female were the default gender identities. And of course, now that's no longer the case. And it can be very difficult to keep up with that changing a sort of picture, and particularly around race and ethnicity, there aren't really global standards. So you have to sort of devise a way that you're going to interpret your data. And I would always recommend starting from what standards there are. So when we look at things like race and ethnicity, we tend to focus on where we think that person sits in the world. And, that may have some correlation with race, but not always. But we're trying to use kind of ISO standards, the kind of standards that are used by global organizations like NATO, so that we're sort of creating apples that can be compared with apples. Because if you create your own taxonomy around how you're going to categorize genders and races, it's going to be very difficult to get meaningful comparisons. It's not to say that we shouldn't be advocating for changes to those standards, but it's always worth bearing that in mind. If you want to get meaningful analysis, you need some kind of similarity with the data sets that you're going to use to benchmark. So you've done all your data. Spoiler alert, you're going to find some bias in your processes. You're going to find out that, I don't know, your female published authors is significantly lower than your female submitted authors, or you're going to, there are going to be things you're going to find out. You're going to find out that you favour certain academic institutions in terms of publications that make it through peer review and so on and so forth. So as I say, your responsibility is to make sure you're doing as much as possible to reduce that bias. And, people always say to me in publishing, we don't have a lot of money, margins are very tight. I think this is non-negotiable, and I think you have to do it, and you have to find that money, and that's a choice. So there's, there might be difficult conversations to have around this, but they need to be had, because we're the gatekeepers of that knowledge and information as a sector, and we have to take that more seriously than we have done. So record your baseline, understand where you are now as best you can, and it won't be perfect, and then track your progress, identify where you need to make changes, but make sure you track them and that you measure them and that you know when you're going to have got to a better place. Try different things, so try different ways of making those decisions in the editorial process. So, recently there's been lots of talk about open peer review and transparent peer review and blind peer review, and lots of these models. And, I don't think any of us know yet what the best answer is, but the only way we're going to know that is by trying it, measuring the outcomes and seeing where we get to. And internally scrutinize those decisions more carefully. And it can be something as simple as a checklist, like do these people know each other? And is that why this recommendation is coming through the process? And if so, do we want to maybe scrutinize what else it's therefore knocked out of the process? And ensure your internal teams are diverse. And I would say this does need to include marketing teams as well. So, your gatekeepers, your editors, your commissioning editors, people like that obviously need to think about these questions of diversity in their areas. But, there are also lots of other people in the publishing process that will support the success of those published authors. So that might be marketing teams, it might be other people in your organization who help to sell that content in. They need to have the confidence that this diverse author pool is a good thing that they should be selling. And if all that sounds terrifying and you hate the thought of data, and like the UK government, you don't really understand how to use Excel, we're here for you. We believe we have a unique proposition in the market. I'm not going to read through this slide, but we take ethics very seriously. We understand the publishing sector, and we try to work with you on that. So if you can't quite face the concept of managing your own data, we're here to help you do that. And that's it from me. I think I'm going to hand back to Clive just to see if there's any questions now.
Nancy, hi. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. As ever, it just throws up so many questions in my mind. So I just want to throw a few at you. How much of this work is really going on? You say it's non-negotiable, and I totally agree. Everyone should do this. What is your view of how many people are really taking this seriously at the moment?
Not enough by a long chalk. So there are some people I'm working with who I think are ahead of the curve on this, and have done the internal thinking about accepting some of the data compromises and taking those sensible decisions. There are lots of people who are thinking about it. I think it's still a struggle for many publishing companies to actually spend money on this stuff, because we're all very well educated, we're very nice people, we can't possibly be biased or racist or anything bad, so we don't really need to spend money on it. We'll just kind of talk about it a bit and that'll solve the problem. So there's an issue there, there's no denying it, but I'm not going away and I'll keep hanging on about it. And there are other providers out there supporting publishers in different ways, but I would say in terms of the industry, we're on the nursery slopes here. Interesting.
It almost feels to me like an ideal opportunity to take to kick off some sort of research project on it and say, how many people, where have you got in this? Where does the board of X publisher have this in their list of priorities? And just see what kind of index you would get. I think it's a fascinating idea.
Well, if anyone wants to fund that, listening to this call, I'm available.
I think you got there before I did with that. Well done. Just a couple of things that I just want to pick. I know you're on a tight time frame, but I just want to pick up a couple of things that you referenced. You refer to yourself as you said, I think you use an ethical AI partner. I'm really interested to know how one defines oneself, or who defines what an what an ethical AI partner is.
So I think I put that in because I know that there's a lot of cynicism about certain aspects of AI. You know, we've all seen some badly implemented AI technology and machine learning technology, and you know, we could start with the A-level results debacle this year, which had some aspects of machine learning in it, which did not go down very well, quite rightly. And I think that also, you know, there's always a concern that if you're looking at a data set that's in itself biased, that bias may then be replicated in the output. So when I talk about ethical AI, I talk about it not being black box. So we're not just feeding data into a machine and trusting what it gives us. We're saying, what might the potential problems of this data set be, because we know that it's probably got bias in it already, and how do we try to mitigate that? And that's why we bring in that human research validation side, because we don't just want to trust the machines, as it were, while AI is still in very early days. But just in the sort of interests of answering your question in a timely fashion, I'm part of an organization called We and AI.
Oh yes, I saw that.
And I'd very much recommend people look at that. So we're a non-profit, we're very early days, but we're trying to address exactly these issues. And you know, we're not there to say all AI is ethical. What we're trying to say is educate yourself about the questions you need to ask of your AI provider to make sure that they've done the due diligence that you would expect them to be behaving in the right kind of way.
Yeah. Okay. We have a question from a delegate attending today. Frederic Belliard writes, as part of what is called the minority, I tried as a publisher to push for diversity, and it is often not well received. Do you have any tips? I love that sort of question.
It's a great question, and me too. and you know, I'm sure you're not alone. I mean, I think, you know, I've been pushing at this door for a good few years, and it sounds like you have as well. I think we have to keep pushing. I think it's increasingly unsustainable for publishers to not take this seriously. I think, you know, a few years ago it was a nice to have. I think now people will vote with their feet. You know, we've seen that this year off the back of Black Lives Matter and some of the COVID impacts. People are no longer going to put up with corporations who don't take this stuff seriously. So I think as an industry, you know, there is a problem there is resistance, but I think the voices pushing for that change are now starting to get their hands on the microphone. So I would say, don't give up. I know it's exhausting and tiring, and sometimes you wish you could give up, but don't give up, and connect with other people. You know, everyone who works in this space, you know, feels that frustration, but it's a great support network as well. There are people out there like me, you know, other people working in this area that you can connect with, and you know, if we're all pushing in the same direction, then you know, we'll go further together.
It's a great answer as well. Thanks, Frederic, for the question. Thanks, Nancy. I'm very conscious that we've used up all of our time, and we do try and stick to time. Thank you so much for an excellent presentation. Thank you for everyone who attended. There will be a recording of this webinar available to you as soon as possible later this evening or tomorrow at the very latest, and to anyone who didn't make it as well. That's not quite the end that we'll hear from Nancy. I'm delighted to say that Contact Week, which is in only 5.5 weeks away now, in November 16th to 19th, Nancy is taking this whole conversation another stage further, and we focus on the content. She'll be talking using AI to create ethical and inclusive content. So that's the next stage, and it's really exciting. We're delighted to have her. I think she's speaking on the first day. If you've not checked out the full program, please do. Big plug for Contact. We're not doing a webinar between then and now, but we are planning more. So if anyone's interested in that, please get in touch. Otherwise, contactlive.com, sorry, to have a good look at the agenda and all of our pricing and various things, and we would love to see as many of you there. Nancy, thanks very much. I'm going to release you into the wild.
Thank you very much.
You're doing next, and we'll see the rest of you all hopefully in November. Goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks.